Welcome friends near and far to our commemoration of World AIDS Day 2020. I would like to honour the traditional custodians of the lands where we gather in person today and all the lands across where we meet in virtual space, scattered as we are in this time of physical separation. I recognise that these lands have always been under Indigenous custodianship and were never ceded. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We pay our respects to elders past and present and those emerging into these important roles, and I extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. I also extend respect to people living with HIV/AIDS and honour their tenacity and endurance. Today we're joined by Mr Stephen Minikin, MP, Shadow Minister for Transport and Main Roads and Member for Chatsworth, taking the place of David Crisafulli, MP, Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Minister for Tourism. I also would like to acknowledge the staff of the Queensland Council for LGBTI Health, Queensland Positive People, and also members of the boards of both of those organisations. And I'd also like to welcome our wonderful signers, Kim Ann and Lucian. Please give them a round of applause. There's also an apology from Councillor Vicky Howard from Central Ward and the Honourable Trevor Evans MP, the Assistant Minister for Waste Reduction and Environmental Management and the Federal Member for Brisbane. This year was a unique one in many ways, not least because it reminded us of another time when a virus wreaked havoc on the world. Then, as now, we recall the adage that a virus doesn't discriminate, people do. The key difference then, though, was that people who were impacted most by the virus were those who were othered. They were the fringe dwellers, the ones whose lives were considered expendable. In 2020, COVID-19 extended its largesse to a larger but broader base, and watching the response was a community who had seen it all before. Only the rush to find a vaccine back then was not the political flashpoint we have witnessed in these past few months. It is particularly prescient then that this year's World AIDS Day theme is now more than ever. My name is Gay Lemon and I'm honoured to be the MC and celebrant for tonight's ceremony. Tonight we will hear from people who've been involved in challenging the stigma and discrimination of HIV/AIDS from its inception in the 1980s through to current day responses. And as we are still addressing this virus of the year, COVID, we're gathered here and virtually across the state. Please be mindful of the 1.5 metre rule, unless of course you are gathered here with people from your own household. There are hand sanitizer stations scattered on site, and remember or cough and sneeze into your elbow, and I'm starting to sound a lot like somebody's mother here, and notify a Queensland Council for LGBTI Health staff member if you're feeling unwell, and they will happily assist. Unlike previous years where we have gathered donations, you'll find QR codes available at the entry and check-in points. This will take you to the Queensland Positive People site, where you can directly support the vital work that they do in supporting people living with HIV/AIDS. Each share who came in had a pack containing a red ribbon and some of the 2020 World AIDS Day merchandise. As I mentioned, the Vigil tonight is being streamed online, and I welcome our virtual guests. I invite those of you online to have a candle ready to light when we conduct the ceremony later, and consider sharing your images of the candle lighting on the QC Facebook page. It is important to appreciate that the land on which we stand has been the source of rights and customs that have been conducted on this country for millennia before we came. In a moment, RDB and Daylight will come forward to do the welcome to country. Auntie Dawn is a Jawa, Yagara and Turgi woman and a respected elder who has tirelessly supported the LGBTIQ sister girl and brother boy community members for many years and has long associations with Indigenous Women's Leadership and Support Group and the Gabunjalam Network in Brisbane. Auntie Dawn was presented with the 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award and the inaugural First Nations Leadership and Engagement Award for outstanding work in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander LGBTIQ sister girl and brother boy communities in Queensland. Graduating from university, Auntie Dawn has been a fierce advocate for women and children's rights, working as a health worker, support worker and literacy tutor. Auntie Dawn also uses art and theatre to tell stories to inspire others to rise from adversity to be the best version of themselves. Please welcome Auntie Dawn Daylight. You. Good afternoon, everyone. Dawn Daylight, born at the dawn of day in the 1940s. I'm a Yawaran, Jawa, and a Turrbal in Mandarin, the Brisbane area. I would like to acknowledge everyone that's here today, tonight, and to pay my respects to our elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also pay respects to the land, the country, the place where I live, where I was born, and where I teach. I'm not a teacher, but I am teaching in our community every day. I pay my respects to our LGBTI community of people, Black, White, Bengal, our Torres Strait Islander people, our non-Indigenous, and our South Sea Islander, and our Torres Strait Islander mob. I am part of this community. I've been in this community for a very long time, not realising what I was. Pride Choir. Always was, always will be, always was, always will be. Though it's not the same, can I have the guitar up a bit? We can create it again. She's waiting for us to see. My bin arms are here now. My bin arms, my ears. Way down on our Mother Earth, on our Mother Earth. For she gave us blood. Like man's the sun has been built along our way. We cannot deny the attempt to genocide, the attempt to genocide. Oh, come and swim. Our spirit still runs free.
always was, always will be. That was the theme this year for our NATO. I would like to welcome my daughter here tonight. She's come up from Tasmania to graduate. I'm not trained as a singer or a guitarist, but the church people used to come around and see us before I was removed from my family. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Have a good evening. Yeah, and I know we're here for a reason. And yeah, I'm part of a reason too. And I've got a really good story. One day, if you've got time, have a look on SBS On Demand. The story was called Lost Daylight, the Daylight Girls. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Auntie Dawn. As always, amazing music. I'd like to introduce now Melissa Fox, who is the Vice President of the Board for Queensland Council for LGBTI Health, to share her thoughts. Please welcome Melissa.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all gathered and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and thank Auntie Dawn for her beautiful welcome to country this evening, made all the more special with the sun setting on the lands of the Jagera and the Turrbal people. I also wish to acknowledge the individuals who passed too soon, not just from HIV and AIDS, but from the stigma and discrimination that led to lack of access to diagnosis, timely research, treatment and support. Hello to everyone here this evening and to those of you joining us from across Queensland and beyond. As Gay said, this year for the first time, we're streaming the Brisbane Vigil live online so people can participate from across Queensland. It is a deep privilege and responsibility to be here this evening representing the Queensland Council for LGBTI Health. QC's President, Pete Black, asked me to pass on his apology that he isn't here this evening. It will be the first Brisbane Vigil that he's missed in over a decade. However, he and our CEO, Beck Reynolds, are in Cairns participating at their World AIDS Day Vigil this evening. In a demonstration of our strengthened partnerships, QC, Two Spirits and Queensland Positive People have partnered in both Brisbane and Cairns to host these World AIDS Day Vigils. With the impact of COVID-19, this year it has been more important than ever to come together to maintain the legacy of World AIDS Day Vigils, going back to the first one in Brisbane, held in 1990. I want to give a heartfelt thanks to all of the volunteers from all of our organisations who have made tonight possible for us to gather together safely. The overall World AIDS Day campaign strategy has been developed with the World AIDS Day Queensland Alliance, a collective of Queensland health representatives, services including Queensland Positive People and community member representatives. I want to acknowledge QPP's extensive work as a part of that, including ensuring that the Story Bridge and almost 20 other landmarks across Queensland are lit up in red each year. Such important and moving visual reminders of remembrance. In addition to tonight's vigils, there was a World AIDS Day Multicultural Forum held on Saturday by the Ethnic Communities Council of Queensland. Morning teas were held in Harvey Bay and Maryborough this morning, and an an event organised by AIDS in Mackay. There is also a remembrance service being held in Townsville this evening and an event held on Cape York tonight. Everyone has a small pack of World AIDS Day resources on your chair, including a red ribbon pin, always a symbol of visibility, awareness and support for people living with HIV. World AIDS Day can mean different things to different people. For some, it is about remembering those who we have lost. For others, it is a time to reflect on how far we have come in HIV prevention. For others too, it is a time to be visible and to reduce HIV stigma and discrimination. The theme of World AIDS Day for 2020 is now more than ever. There are a series of key messages that sit under that, and the Vigil specific one is now more than ever. It's time to remember. The other messages are, now more than ever, support is accessible. Now more than ever, testing is convenient. Now more than ever, we can all end stigma. And now more than ever, you equals you is bringing us together. I want to acknowledge the lived experience and resilience of people living with HIV/AIDS who are here in person and online this evening. In particular tonight, I want to acknowledge Phil Carswell, a long-time HIV activist and consumer representative who I have had the privilege to work with more closely than ever this year in my day job as CEO of Health Consumers Queensland, working to amplify and make central the voice of health consumers in the response to COVID-19. We will get to hear directly from Phil himself a little later, but in Queensland's exemplary response to COVID-19 and the amazing position that we are in as a state, owes consumers like Phil much in terms of lessons learnt from the HIV movement about the power of community-led messaging, prevention and models of testing and treatment. UNAIDS published guidance on the 20th of March 2020, early in the COVID-19 pandemic, as you'll recall, just as Queensland went into lockdown. They called on countries to adopt a human rights-based approach in responding to the global outbreak of COVID-19 that put communities at the centre and respected the rights and dignity of all, to help guide governments, communities and other stakeholders in planning and implementing measures to contain the pandemic. It was titled Lessons from HIV for an Effective Community-Led Response. It opened with 7 takeaways, the first 4 of which really resonated for me in rereading them recently, in terms of the ways of working that have been done by consumer advocates like Phil, our organisations and the state government. 1. Engage affected communities from the beginning in all response measures to build trust, ensure suitability and effectiveness, and to avoid indirect or unintended harms and ensure the frequent sharing of information. 2. Combat all forms of stigma and discrimination, including those based on race, social contacts, profession, and those directed towards marginalised groups that prevent them from accessing care. 3. Ensure access to free or affordable screening, testing, and care for the most vulnerable and hard to reach. And these populations have again borne the brunt of a pandemic, particularly around their health, social isolation, and economic needs. And 4, remove barriers to people protecting their own health and that of their communities, fear of unemployment, healthcare costs, presence of fake news and misinformation, lack of sanitation, infrastructure, and so forth. I want to acknowledge the role that organisations like QPP, QC and Two Spirits have played during the pandemic to share public health messages targeted at our communities, connecting our communities with health and wellbeing services and social supports by being agile and pivoting, that word, how they delivered services to keep their clients and staff safe. Our organisations were already in strong positions with links to the community, our invaluable volunteers and other services. And they have come through this time stronger, with ways of working which will remain to continue to support our communities, like increased access to telehealth. But now, as restrictions have eased, borders have opened, and we look to the rollout of a vaccine for COVID-19 early next year, we need to ensure that people living with HIV get the care that they need, whether that is early access to the vaccine, HIV treatment, coordinated and accessible care for other health conditions, and social and emotional and economic support. Now, more than ever, nobody should be left behind. Thank you.
Sister Mary Angela Doyle, but unfortunately she can't be with us here tonight, and that's a true shame. She's a remarkable human being, and if you don't know her story, I strongly suggest that you do find out. She was pivotal in the movement here in Queensland. However, I am privileged to be able to read her words for you. Dear friends, it is disappointing for me that I cannot be with you this evening at New Farm Park as you celebrate once again World AIDS Day Candlelight Vigil. While I cannot be there in person, be assured that I am there with you in spirit, standing with you as I have loved to do in differing circumstances in the past. My love and respect for you all began many years ago, and this will never change. Memories of people I knew then remain vivid in my mind. They are precious memories. Your invitations to me to join with you for special occasions are greatly appreciated. I often thank God I was the one that happened to be at the Mater at that time. I thank God too for advances in medicine that improve all of our lives. For 7 years I had the privilege of being involved with the Queensland AIDS Council, and I remember with affection Bill Rutkin. I am grateful to Bill and to all of that time for allowing me to be part of their life journey. In these people, whom I've come to know well, I saw patience in sickness and gracious acceptance of help offered and provided. I think of them often, and I pray in gratitude for their acceptance of me. When ill health strikes me, may I too be patient and gracious in my helplessness. May God bless each and every one of you, Sister Angela Mary. And I'm hoping somebody is technologically savvy where she is right now, and maybe she saw her words, and I do hope I delivered them in the spirit they were intended. And now I'd like to introduce the absolutely remarkable Garrett Lyon to sing for us.
Remarkable. Never had that one before. Hello everybody. My name is Garrett Lyon. I'm a proud Durumble and Woolly Woolly man, originally born and raised in Rockhampton, central Queensland. And I would like to personally pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Yagara and Turrbal people. Pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. Pay my respects to Auntie Dawn, Uncle Phil, Sister Sarah, and LGBTI Health, First Nations mob in the audience. And I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge people living with HIV, AIDS, and the people we've lost. And I'm going to sing a couple of songs for you. The first one I'm going to sing is a song that I wrote during quarantine called Little Things. And it's basically about when you find yourself in that uncomfortable limbo, I guess, after you've lost someone or a breakup. And you're just trying to get over them, but you keep finding things like a t-shirt that belonged to them, or one of their songs comes on, and it takes you right back to being with them. So yeah, I hope you like it.
it's not your fault. I just had to get that out the way. But I don't understand how you can expect me to move on while you're still here. It's not in the way you hold me that feeling's dead and gone, but it's the way you can control me through the words of our song. It can't last a day. You should have seen the look on my face. I was numb. I swear I'm doing okay. I don't need you. I always run to things that remind me of you. And I don't know what to do. No. About these little things that remind me of you. It could be as simple as being out on the street and hear your name, or finding your t-shirt and inside I just burst into flames, or the post on the corner where we shared our first kiss. I won't even go. I swear I'm doing okay. I don't need you. I always run to things that remind me of you. And I don't know what to do about these little things that remind me of you. But I did it 'cause there's just so many emotional lines. I'm sure you're thinking of you. I just can't get away from you. I always run to things that remind me of you. Don't know what to do about these little things that remind me of you. Yes, it's all the little things, yeah, that remind me of you.
Thank you. I'm going to do one more song. It's a cover of one of my favourite songs called Stand By Me, and it's just the song that I remember growing up hearing my uncles sing at Benfield with barbecues. So yeah, I try and sing this at every event to kind of pay my respects to my mum. So yeah, I hope you like it. Sing along if you want.
When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light that I see. No, I won't be afraid. No, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Just as long as you stand by me. Now if the sky that we look upon, should tumble and fall, all the mountains, they should crumble to the sea, baby. I won't cry. I won't cry. No, I won't shed one tear. Just alone as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me, just alone as you stand by me. Whenever you're in trouble, won't you stand by me? Oh, stand by me, just alone as you stand by me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for having me this time. Very honored. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce you now to Chris Howard. Chris has been living with HIV for 34 years and has worked in the Queensland HIV treatment and care sector for the past 25 years and currently holds the position of Executive Program Manager with Queensland Positive People and is the Treasurer and Secretary of the National Association of People with HIV Australia. Please welcome Chris Howard.
Thanks, Gay. Good evening. Firstly, I would like to thank Auntie Dawn for that very wonderful welcome to country and acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people, the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we are meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I wanted to thank the organisers for asking me to speak this evening. I am deeply humbled and honoured. I also want to acknowledge that my experience is through the lens of a white cisgendered male, and I come from a place of privilege. I have never spoken publicly about my personal lived experience of HIV. I am a deeply private person and have always thought of my story as unremarkable. However, after many days of reliving painful memories of grief and loss and facing the cumulative trauma of many years of HIV and AIDS since the early 80s, I came to the realisation that I had been given the privilege and the responsibility of making visible and giving a voice to those people who have died of AIDS and to those people currently living with HIV and AIDS. My story is only one story of the 38 million people living with HIV and AIDS and the 33 million people who have died of AIDS. My story, our story, honours their memories, their legacies, their courage, their sacrifice. Now, more than ever, it's time to remember. It was the year the Chernobyl nuclear disaster happened in the Soviet Union. Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, Ronald Reagan, the US President. The Oprah Winfrey Show was first broadcast on television, and Diana Ross and Billy Joel were at the top of the Australian music charts. It was also the year the virus known to cause AIDS was given the name HIV. It was 1986, I was 23 and diagnosed with HIV. I was told by my doctor if I was lucky, I had 2 years to live. A diagnosis of HIV at that time was confronting. Unlike today, there was no treatment. A diagnosis of HIV meant certain death. As a young person full of life, hopes and dreams for the future, I was now faced with the prospect of preparing to die. At the time, HIV was still called by some the gay plague or GRID, gay-related immune disease. There was much fear in the gay community, hysteria in the general community, and sensationalism in the media. Gay men were perceived as the vectors of disease, infecting innocent people through blood transfusions. There was much public hostility and anger directed towards people with HIV. We were simply hated. I did not know anyone else who had the virus. I was ashamed, I was lonely, and simply terrified of anyone finding out. Disclosing your HIV status was something you did not do back then. You held it close. You kept a secret. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer the same year, having lost my sister in a motor vehicle accident some years earlier. Disclosing my status to my family was not an option. No one wants to bring upon their family the pain of losing another child, let alone the shame of losing a child to AIDS. Burdened with the diagnosis, I decided to disclose to a trusted friend. However, that trust was broken. I no longer had control over my secret. The silver lining for me in that unfortunate disclosure meant that those friends, also harbouring the secret of their own diagnosis, came forward. The solidarity that was born out of a shared lived experience of HIV and AIDS was liberating. Finally, I felt acknowledged, visible. There were others like me. In 1987, the year following my diagnosis, the Grim Reaper television commercial was released. The ad constantly reminded me of my impending death. I saw myself as one of the bowling pins that would soon be knocked down and swept away. Adding to the burden we already experienced from having HIV, the ad portrayed us as people to be loathed, to be feared and avoided. People around me were already sick and dying. I recall visiting a friend in Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital in Melbourne. There was room after room of very sick and dying people. I remember being very confused. I could hear people crying whilst at the same time I could hear laughter and music. These were the confused sounds of both mourning and the celebration of lives cut short. The late 80s was a period of much suffering and death as AIDS took grip of the gay community. I remember the Sydney Star Observer at the time being crammed full of page after page of obituaries of people who had died just that week. Familiar faces, people like me, people like us. AZT, a former cancer drug, showed early promise in the US. However, there was so slow progress in making the drug available here in Australia. The year Freddie Mercury died was 1991. My mother had not long died the year before. Despite the odds, I had outlived her. I had saved her the pain of losing a child to AIDS. It was now okay for me to die. I had defied the odds and I'd lived more than 3 years than I was supposed to. However, my immune system had started to decline. I became eligible for AZT. Back then, you needed to be sick to access drugs like AZT. The drug was highly toxic and made me very unwell. However, I persisted. It bought me time. Meanwhile, my friends continued to become sick and die. Death came quickly for some and slow for others from AIDS-related illnesses we had never heard of before. Robert, my closest friend, experienced the sudden onset of severe headaches. He was diagnosed with Mycobacterium avium complex and cytomegalovirus retinitis. He went blind. I drove 12 hours to be by his side at the John Hunter Hospital. He died an hour before. Don, he died of Kaposi sarcoma, a purple-coloured cancer that appeared on his face and all over his body. He hardly showed his face in the last month of his life. Mark, he died of AIDS-related dementia. He gradually slipped away, vacant, confused, and lost. Karen, having nursed her husband with AIDS, maintained that AZT, the toxic drug, was what killed him. She refused treatment for herself and died from B-cell lymphoma, leaving a child behind. Terry was late diagnosed at the Gold Coast Hospital with full-blown AIDS. I remember walking into his room, we were barrier nursed back then, and him saying to me, "How come I'm here and not you?" He died a few days later from pneumonia. Peter went rapidly downhill after the death of his partner. He experienced HIV-related hypomania and made a conscious decision to take his own life before AIDS did. He died alone. These were only some of the people I knew that were lost to AIDS. When writing this speech, I remembered their faces looking back at me. Their eyes told stories of pain, of fear, of loneliness and sadness. They knew they were dying. These people have a special place in my heart. Many people did not have family to care for them. There was shame, there was ignorance, there was judgment, there was stigma, there was fear of contagion. Some people died alone, without family, without friends. We, however, were lucky. This was the time we cared for each other, we held each other close, we shared uncertain futures. We were people with a virus. Now, more than ever, it's time to remember. We used to sit around after funerals of our friends and joke about who was next, who had the look, we used to say. We often saw ourselves as the walking dead. It was only a matter of time. We laughed and we cried as we shared stories and memories while making quilts for those we loved. We attended candlelight vigils like this one and quilt dedication ceremonies. We also had our allies at our sides, people who did not have HIV. They were friends and lovers, our carers. They were men, they were women, they were activists, they were our community. Together we were strong. Together we made a difference in the face of adversity. After I failed AZT, I progressed through a series of new drugs, including DDI, DDC and D4T, all with horrendous side effects, including peripheral neuropathy, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, headaches, the list goes on. Despite these drugs buying me more time, I soon developed multi-resistant virus, meaning that treatments were no longer effective. By 1995, my CD4 count had fallen to 50, I had lost significant weight and struggled with the basic activities of daily living. I received my own AIDS diagnosis. Grateful that my 2 years have been extended to 9, I resigned myself to the fact that my time had come. I should prepare to die. My doctor talked to me about a clinical trial of a new experimental drug called MK639. The trial was a double randomised blinded trial, which meant that neither the doctor or I knew if I was receiving the drug or a placebo. I was eligible because of my low CD4 count and AIDS diagnosis. Gradually my health started to improve. It turned out that I was receiving the drug. The drug, later called Indinavir, was from a class of drugs called protease inhibitors. They were a game changer, and they changed the face of HIV treatment and virtually stopped HIV dead in its tracks. I often wonder if my survival was due to a random draw of chance. If I was the lucky one who received the active drug, then what happened to those that got the placebo? Did they die? I have never known the answer to this question, and it haunts me to this day. Survivor guilt is something that some of us living long-term with HIV must contend with. We survived, but many did not. From the early days of the epidemic, people with HIV were the subjects of clinical and social research. We gave our bodies, our blood, our tissues for research to further the understanding of HIV in the hope of a better future for our brothers and sisters, for our community. It is through this participation in research that we have seen the development of the effective treatments of today. Consider undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals U, or perhaps even pre-exposure prophylaxis used to prevent HIV. These drugs would not be possible if it wasn't for people with HIV. We owe a debt of gratitude to people with HIV and AIDS for their sacrifice. COVID-19 is the first global pandemic to hit the world since HIV and AIDS, since the early 80s. For me as a person with HIV, there was a sense of déjà vu. I had seen this before. COVID-19 was triggering and re-traumatising for me. I relived those early days of the HIV epidemic. As I mentioned earlier, when AIDS emerged, it was visible in the gay community and called the gay plague or GRID. Attaching a virus to a part of the community based on sexual preference, ethnicity, or gender is stigma in action. With COVID-19 originating in Wuhan, China, we saw people of Asian descent here in Australia being publicly vilified, being spat on, heckled, and demonised. It certainly does not help when you have people in positions of power that refer to COVID-19 as the China virus. Like HIV, COVID is a virus and can affect anyone. It was good to see that the stigma attached to COVID was short-lived. However, this is not the case with HIV. Unlike COVID, HIV is still a highly stigmatised condition. Over the past 34 years of my journey, I have witnessed great progress to almost defeat the virus through effective treatment. However, there has always been a bigger challenge than the virus itself, and that is stigma. Stigma has remained a constant threat, and unlike treatment, we've seen little progress. We must remember, stigma is a human construct. It's created by people, not the virus. Stigma in all its forms has placed an immeasurable burden on people with HIV since the beginning of the epidemic. HIV stigma continues to keep people silent. It prevents people from testing and seeking treatment, and exacerbates poverty, marginalisation, and vulnerability. HIV will never be defeated whilst people of colour, trans and gender diverse people, and women continue to be disproportionately impacted by HIV and AIDS. The intersectionality of identity coupled with structural, anticipated, experienced and internalised stigma erode the progress that has been made by treatment. Now more than ever, we can all end stigma. Of my 34 years of HIV, I've only shared the first 10. There are another 24, however, I will save you all from hearing about those. However, for 33 million people, their stories were cut short. Many far too soon and in the prime of their lives. Unlike me, they never got to tell their story. They never got to realise their hopes, their dreams. I remember you, we remember you. Now more than ever, it's time to remember. For 38 million of us, our stories continue, and whilst we applaud the great progress with treatment, it is important to remember that we have needs and lives beyond undetectable viral load. Our journey does not end with undetectable. We are still here, we combat stigma and discrimination, we are getting old, and some of us are lonely. Now more than ever, it's time to remember. If HIV has taught me one thing, it has taught me gratitude. I have gratitude that I stand before you to tell my story. I have gratitude that I survived. But most importantly, I have a depth of gratitude to people with HIV and AIDS, those who have gone before, those who blazed a trail so we might live. I honour the lives of those we have lost and those who are living. I honour your memory, your legacy, your courage, your bravery, your sacrifice. When you light a candle this evening, remember the lighting of a candle brings forth light. It makes visible things which might not have otherwise been seen. I hope your candle will give visibility to a special memory, a friend, a loved one. I hope you will hold your candle as a beacon in memory of all those people with HIV and AIDS. Now, more than ever, it's time to remember. Thank you.
Takes a lot of courage to be able to share your story, and I'm sure the other 24 years would be just as fascinating. It was amazing. So many memories in that. Our second speaker is someone I know well, the lovely Phil Carswell. Phil Carswell has been active in prevention, particularly in HIV/AIDS, since 1982. He has worked as the first president of the Victorian AIDS Council, then as Policy and Programs Manager for the AIDS STD unit of the Victorian Health Department. He sat on the National Advisory Committee on AIDS with Ida Buttrose as chair, and later became manager of the AIDS and Sexual Health branch of Queensland Health. He retired from work in 2012 and became an active health consumer and advocate, as well as a dialysis patient and later as a renal transplant patient. He is currently writing, well, actually he's just finished writing his memoir of his times during the HIV/AIDS pandemic as we deal with this new pandemic of COVID-19. Please welcome Phil.
Thank you, everybody, and I would too like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, extend my sincere appreciation for elders past, present and emerging. Nothing never was ceded, always was and always will be. I also want to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience, both here and at home, and I want to pay my respects to the people who went before me, the people with HIV and AIDS who are no longer with us. As an elder, I have a great gap in my life, and as Chris so eloquently put it, there are many faces that I see on days like today. Now, unfortunately, I didn't write prepared speeches like my colleagues have done, because I've spent the last 15 years writing a book, and I didn't want to really sit down and write some more. So I just made some notes. I think a day of remembrance needs to start with some stories, and Chris has done a beautiful job in telling some of the personal stories that were around. But I was wanting to focus more on what we did as people and as activists and as community leaders and as people who were scared to death of what was going to happen. We first heard vague reports in 1981 that something was going on, that young men were walking down the Castro in San Francisco with walking sticks and hollowed out cheeks and deathly eyes. We heard these stories by a remarkable chain of informants, and that's one of the good things about the gay community at the time. We all knew each other and we all talked to each other. And the people who told us what was going on were the Qantas stewards, who were coming back from San Francisco and New York, Berlin and other places, London, and all said the same thing. They didn't know what it was, they didn't know how it spread, and they didn't know what the future held. So we were looking at a very grim future. No one knew anything about it, no one. We had to decide on how do we send out a preventive measure, a preventive education measure, if we don't know what it is we're actually fighting. Some said it was a new virus. Other people said it was a combination of different viruses that had mutated together. Some said that gay men had taken too many drugs and their immune systems were collapsing. Some people said it was caused by kissing. And I thought to myself, if I have to live in a world where I can't kiss anybody, I don't really see the point of going on. That's not a life. That's not intimacy. That's not feeling the warmth and the humanity of other people. The other theory was that gay men had too many sexually transmissible infections, and these had weakened the body as well. And what we came to realise was that all this research was being done using the cohort called previously healthy gay men. But in fact, having an STI back in those days was considered an occupational hazard. You went and got a jab, or you took some pills, stayed off the scene for a couple of weeks, and then out you went again. The only one we were really frightened of was herpes. But this was a whole new ballgame. This was something much more serious that we were facing. The reports started to come in, and it appeared, first there was a report of 5 men in Los Angeles. Then that doctor put his findings in the CDC's Mortality and Morbidity Weekly Report, which we all learnt to read every week when it came out, required reading for any AIDS activist. By the end of 2 months, there were 47 cases known, and by the end of the year, 127, of which half had died. Now that mortality rate was staggering for any infectious disease. It was well over 50%. And it looked like the longer it went on, the mortality rate was going to be 100%. By comparison, COVID has a mortality rate of 2%, and that's considered bad. So you can imagine how we felt facing a virus with 100% mortality rate. There was real terror. We were relying on air-freighted copies of the overseas gay press. There were very few doctors who took an interest, apart from a small cohort of gay GPs who were noticing their waiting rooms starting to fill up with some very sick boys. And there was absolutely no one in government who gave a tinker's cuss about it. They couldn't work out why all these strange groups of people were knocking on their door wanting to have a meeting. So, well, what was to be done? Well, what was to be done was we had to become activists. We had to learn as much as we could. We had to know medical terminology. We had to be able to sit down around a table with doctors, not just GPs, but the big wigs who run Australian medical politics. And there's a few nasty ones in there, I tell you. And be able to argue with them that they couldn't do anything without the community input. That it was a community voice, our lived experience. They just didn't understand that when they put out a press release, that the media picked up on the 1 or 2 sentences that were inflammatory, and they became the headlines. They couldn't understand that. But we're doctors. People will do what we say. We have a special place. You know, we are respected and honoured. So I told them that was bullshit. One of them even had the gall to say to me, "We don't normally talk to people like you, patients. No. We're much too concerned with the theoretical and the epidemiological and the virological." And I said, you can't talk about this disease without understanding how it affects people as a whole. It's not about viruses and cells and bodies. It's about human beings. And our voice has to be heard. Fortunately, we had a health minister federally after the election of the Hawke government, a guy by the name of Neil Blewett. And that was one of the strokes of luck in our 30 years, that our first health minister was a brilliant man, aided by a couple of amazing advisors. Never underestimate ministerial advisors. They're a very good bunch of people. One of them happened to be a guy called Bill Botel, who I knew earlier, who was a gay man. And he kept Neil apprised and kept him up to date with everything that was going on. So Neil was never spooked by the virus, unlike other government people who were terrified of it because it was political death. You were talking about gay sex, anal intercourse, injecting drugs, sex workers, all these things, and their clients, all these things that, most politicians would shy away from. Neil became quite comfortable with it. So we actually ended up knowing more about this disease through our research and knowing and hearing from people like Chris and others what the lived experience was. We actually knew more than the doctors did. And they sort of realised that after a while, because what they wanted to do was use the traditional public health measures. You identify, you test, you isolate, you treat and release. That's how you normally manage pandemics. Trouble is, we didn't have a test for the first 4 years. You couldn't find out if you had it or not. Then we had no drugs for treatment till 87. That wasn't a very good one either. And there was no place to isolate. How do you isolate people who look like you and me? Up here there was talk of reopening Peel Island and isolating people with HIV out there in the old leprous area, which gave you an idea of the level of public discussion. We found, we called it discrimination back then, but it was really stigma, both in the media and in the public, and unfortunately even in some service providers. There were dentists who would come out double gowned and make you the last patient of the day and pay not only for your treatment but pay for the disposal of all the equipment they threw away because it had come in contact with your blood. There were some doctors who literally refused to have you sit and take appointments. Now, the other thing I want to do is put in context for people who are listening both here and at home what it was like to try and build an organisation of people who were keen to do something back in 83, 84, 85. We had no computers, we had no mobile phones, we had no emails, we didn't have Dr. Google. All we had was written publications, STD phone calls, which we could make after 6 o'clock when it was cheaper, and face-to-face meetings, which we could barely afford because airline flights were terribly expensive. So, without any of that electronic stuff that people have got around today, we had to work on word of mouth. And in lots of ways I see it as a blessing, because I had to sit down in meetings with ministers and senior doctors and literally look them in the eye and say, we're not going out of this room until you give me an answer to this question because my friends are dying. And it worked, which was amazed me. I thought, and the other thing you learn is that most politicians are actually quite human and frail and able to be blackmailed as anybody else, which helps a great deal. They were scared as we were. What we did do is we became fierce, and I think that fierceness was summed up by Chris beautifully. We weren't going to let this go by and be ignored, no way. And a whole group of people thought even the AIDS councils weren't being strong enough. So they became ACT UP, God bless them. And so while I was as a bureaucrat in the health department, talking to ministers and advisors and senior health bureaucrats, there'd be ACT UP on the outside banging on the windows. And it was so nice to be able to say, well, look, Minister, don't be scared by them. How about we try this as an answer? And of course, that was what we were after in the first place. And they said, yes, give it to me. I'll do that. That's a good idea, Phil. So it was really useful to understand that we used a double-pronged approach to activism. Not all activism happens with banners and flags and people yelling and screaming. Activism happens by the bedside, in the family, in the workplace, and amongst your friends and others. Activism is one-on-one talking. Activism is hearing people's personal stories and letting them into your heart. That's what activism builds up to be. So we were angry, we were exhausted from 16-hour days, but then we suddenly discovered that we needed volunteers to help people who were getting sick. And literally thousands of people around Australia stepped forward and did the stuff that needs to happen when a person is dying at home. They cleaned up the shit and the vomit and the blood and the mess. They cleaned up the house, they walked the dogs, they did the shopping. They sat and held hands as people drew their final breath. Because unlike other communities in our society, the gay community doesn't have a natural family structure. You have a family of origin, your biological family, and you have a family of choice, if you're lucky enough to find them. And so we had biological families who shunned their sons and brothers and uncles and wouldn't see them or talk to them or let them in the house. Or if they did come and visit, their children were kept away from them, and they were given paper plates and plastic knives and forks, which were burnt afterwards. And there are many stories, unfortunately, of funerals of people who died of AIDS, where the family came in afterwards, changed the locks on the house and threw all the possessions out, including those of any partners who had no legal standing whatsoever. So every day there was a drama of some sort like that. But those volunteers who stepped up as support workers, beautiful people like John Ebert, who I know is watching at home tonight, did remarkable work and gave people dignity and gave people a good death, which is as much as you can hope for in a situation like this. They had real grace, and grace under pressure is what I think defined a lot of our generation. I want to finish by saying two things. We often talk about the Australian national response to AIDS as being exemplary, and basically it was. However, not here in Queensland. Here in Queensland you had the unfortunate bad luck of having Joe Bjelke-Petersen as your Premier, our Premier. And you had a series of health ministers who were quite ignorant, willfully ignorant, and scared to death of this disease. They even, once Neil Blewett started handing out money, refused to take most of the money because they didn't want to be seen to be giving it to an AIDS council that was promoting an illegal activity. When there was a huge explosion of media panic in November '84, after 4 babies here in Brisbane died from a tainted blood transfusion, there was a meeting held of all health ministers 2 days later, and the Queensland delegation was given strict instructions by the Cabinet that if any known homosexuals walked into the room, then they were to walk out. So Neil Blewett sat down with us beforehand and explained to us why that was the case, and then said, what do you want? I'll make sure it gets raised, and I'll talk to you straight after the meeting and we'll make sure it gets done. And yes, it was done. But the notion of a government delegation threatening to walk out if there were any known homosexuals, the reality was there were, of course, homosexuals in the room, but they weren't known. Anyway, that's another story. I wanted to also identify heroes like Bill Rutkin. I'm hoping he's watching tonight, because political leadership under this sort of pressure was quite extraordinary. If you spoke up on behalf of the AIDS Council, Special Branch opened up a file on you, and your movements were monitored. Newspapers vilified you, photos were published, and slanderous things were said and done. There was dreadful verbal and sometimes physical violence. On the night that the news broke about those 4 babies dying, it was a Thursday night, the 15th of November, I remember it well. There was a karate school up in Fortitude Valley who sent their students out for the night to practice at the gay bars. And so those nights and the days afterwards were just horrible, because people took it on their own hands to be vigilantes and demand that the donor, once he was identified, demanded that the only honourable thing he could do was commit suicide, which he didn't do, because he was a beautiful young kid. He only had a handful of sexual contacts in his life, but one of them was an American tourist who unfortunately infected him. I want to say thank you to Sister Angela Mary. She became the bag lady. When the feds couldn't get any money to the state government or to Quack, they gave the money to Sam. Sister Angela Mary. And Sister Angela Mary would walk across Vulture Street and hand the money over to Bill at the house that Quack got from Sisters of Mercy. And Bill would provide her with an annual budget and accounts, and she would pass that back up to the health department. So she was the middleman, if you like, middle nun of the response up here in Queensland, because no one would stand up to Joe, except people like Sister Angela Mary, and people like Janine Walker, and people like there are lots of good women who stepped forward and lent a hand, because known homosexuals talking had no credibility. In fact, they had very little chance of leading a normal life again. The last thing I want to mention is history revolves around really interesting coincidences, bits of luck that happen. Quack had been trying to get tax deductible status for years, but Joe and Cabinet put every obstacle in their way that they could. Well, one day, and apparently this became quite a pattern amongst a whole lot of departments, Joe was interstate. So Paul Clawson, the treasurer at the time, rang up Bill Rutkin and said, if you want to get incorporation through, give me the papers this afternoon and you'll have them by tonight. Joe's out of town. So Bill, being the warrior that he is, got the papers into George Street. Sure enough, they were signed on the spot, and there was only one letter of support. I suppose I can say this now. And there was a letter of support from Mrs. Flo Bjelke-Petersen. So people, yeah, just imagine the pillow talk. But in the meantime, condom vending machines were installed by a number of the universities around Brisbane. And Joe said he was disgusted by it and appalled, and he thought that was turning the universities into brothels, and those condom vending machines should be removed. So he gave a direct order to the health minister at the time that they were to be removed, or else he was going to lose his cabinet seat and sit in the back benches. So the health minister agreed. Thought he had more power in cabinet than out, and he went away and organised for some of the biggest, fattest and most unfit policemen to be part of the raiding party. And one of his advisors happened to mention it several times to various press outlets. So when the police arrived the next couple of days to do the job, because they knew exactly when it was going to happen, all the media were there to see these sweaty, grunting men in blue shirts trying to rip a condom vending machine off the wall. And when they opened it, they found that all the condoms were gone, so the job had been done. That issue started to crystallise the fight within the Queensland Cabinet about this pure irrationality of the Premier and the way that things were going right off the rails. And that led, in part, to the spill, and then the election, and then the loss of 30 years of the Bjelke-Petersen government, and the introduction of Wayne Goss, and decriminalisation of homosexuality, recognition of crack, and funding for crack, and ministerial meetings with crack. So every little bit helps, okay? Everybody can be an activist. Everybody can do something to make a difference. On these nights of remembrance, I think of 100 different people. But I always want to end with a call to action, because it's not over yet. We've seen this year, during the space of 9 months, 3 different vaccines formed, or potentially effective vaccines formed for COVID-19. Where's our vaccine after 37 years? I want people to remember that there are people with HIV who are getting older, and now the impacts of geriatrics, multiple diseases, and long-term living with the virus is causing a number of unforeseen illnesses and needs for those people. And yet our state government sees prevention as its only priority. Some people I know call it, we're not interested in hand-holding anymore. And I think, bugger you, these people are still people living with HIV. They are still part of our responsibility. They are having emerging needs, and we need to respond to them because they need some help and care. I also want to point out that there are people living with HIV and people with AIDS all around the world tonight. There are people getting infected every few seconds. A young girl in South Africa, a person who uses drugs in East Europe, where needle exchanges aren't available, where methadone's not available. A young black gay boy in Atlanta. Atlanta now has basically the same infection rates as Southern Africa. There are people like that in parts of the world where the fault lines have been exposed, where AIDS is still finding, HIV is still finding a way to creep through, exactly like COVID's doing. It's about wealth and geography, gender, and power, and about people who've got it, and people who haven't. And that's what viruses do. They are very efficient bits of killing machines. They don't care about your class, they don't care about your income, they don't care about your background or what school you went to, or who you know, or whatever. They just want to get inside you and kill you. Then they want to go and find somebody else to kill. They are relentless, these viruses, and unforgiving. And we have to continue that fight. Remember the people we lost, and as Chris so beautifully said, remember the heroes who stepped forward for clinical trials, and those people in hospital who let invasive procedures like lumbar punctures and sputum inducements and all sorts of other dreadful medical things done so doctors could gather and researchers could gather data that would help the next ones coming through. That sacrifice sometimes never gets mentioned, but those people were heroes as well. So a friend of mine, a very wise friend of mine, told me very early on in the epidemic when I decided to take an active role in something I thought was going to last for a little while, but ended up lasting for 37 years and still going, that remembrance is important and death is obviously final. But the death of one person doesn't mean the relationship is over. If you remember them in your heart, then that relationship lives. And those words have got me through many, many dark nights and dark days. So tonight, as we remember the people we've lost, remember them, and the love will still be there. But please, use that love and the anger to push and to keep pushing. Thank you.
In a moment, we begin the candle lighting ceremony. Once again, I remind everybody here to please respect the 1.5 metre rule when placing your candles. Tables have been set up around the rotunda to help with this. Tonight, the Brisbane Pride Choir will accompany the candle lighting with the songs From the Stars and We Shall Overcome. So I invite the 4 candle bearers to come forward. We will light candles for you to shatter the darkness and bless the times that we knew. Like a beacon in the night, these flames will burn bright and shine into the shadow places of our hearts. The seasons come and go, and weary from the change, we keep moving on. But you know it's not the same when we're walking all alone. Do you hear us call your names? Do you hear us sing the songs we used to sing? You filled our lives with wonder, touched us with surprise, always saw that something special deep within your eyes. And through the good times and the bad, we carried on with pride, and now we hold on to love and life we knew when you were by our side. The first candle we light reminds us that our sorrow and joy journey together as different aspects of our memories. Because we knew, loved and thrived in our connections, we pause today to recall the sorrow of their endings. But joy was there first, and love endures. We light the white candle to signify community, those that we remember as so vibrant and alive. And this one, here and now, where our tribes come together to commemorate endurance, resilience and survival of all of those people living with and affected by HIV/AIDS. The second candle, a purple one, is lit in their memory. It was not always an easy journey, this path of loss. There were days of laughter and of tears. There was anger and hurt and pain too. Amongst it all, there was the vibrancy of the lives we shared and the colours of the world that spoke to our hearts. And always, always the thread of hope that yearned to quell the injustice of this disease. The blue candle shines a light on the mysteries that are life and death. In awe and wonder, our minds traverse the spaces in between to the stories lived within that span. Stories of inspiration and strength, sorrow and courage. We are thankful for the gift of life, even though life does not come without death and endings. We are thankful for the persons whose lives touched and changed our own. The third candle reminds us all to live our lives in authentic ways, to make our lives meaningful and remembering, never to forget. The final candle, the colour of life's blood, is the symbol of hope. Hope that stigma no longer resides and all people live their lives without apprehension, and where we create a loving and respectful world for those who live with HIV/AIDS. Hope for a future where HIV/AIDS becomes a distant memory, relegated to the history books as an example of how a community's tenacity and self-belief led to a global movement of change. We light these candles so that the light of those we have loved and lost will also shine, particularly at this time of year when we gather as a family, born or made, and when our memories are so strong. This night we are a family, a community of brothers, sisters, lovers, family and friends, sharing this night of remembrance, cherishing the special place that will always hold for those whose faces are no longer part of our lives, but whose memories linger in the shadowy places of the heart. I'd like to invite our special guests and honoured members to come forward and light your candles first, and then after they have lit their candles, I invite the staff and volunteers of QC to also come forward, and those members of QPP who are here tonight as well. So please, our honoured guests. From the stars Now a minute's silence, please. Remember us, you who are living. Restore us, renew us. Speak for our silence. Continue our work. Bless the breath of life. Sing of the hidden patterns. Weave the web of peace. Live, laugh, and love for us. Thank you everyone for your presence here tonight in real time and virtually. For our friends online, I hope you will share your pictures of your virtual candle lighting and remember gently those who have left the physical realm but remain with us here in spirit. Gone, but certainly never forgotten. For those here present, should you wish to continue sharing memories, the Sportsman's Hotel at 130 Leichhardt Street, Spring Hill, will have their restaurant open for orders up until 9 p.m. tonight for you. As the Pride Choir offers their rendition of Fleetwood Mac's Don't Stop, I wish you all well and pray that life is good for you from here on in. Go well and in peace. Thank you, everybody.
Don't stop thinking about tomorrow.